understanding the past is so important to mapping out the future. And so if we're going to think about managing the risks in the current international environment, and that includes for businesses, thinking about risks all over the world, but including with China, then we need to understand what went wrong. And so last time in Risk, in the last episode, I was talking about the period of interdependence, the globalization era, when this deep integration occurred, in particular in Asia, globalization being driven by the changes that were occurring in Asia, whereas in the West it was understood, in particular in the US and Europe, it was understood that the globalization process was being driven by the West. And there was an expectation that as Asia and as China in particular modernized and developed, that it would westernize. Now, this was never a realistic scenario, and so today I'm going to continue reading some excerpts from my book, A New Era of Risk, and we're going to look at this question of just what went wrong in the period of globalization, how did it all start to unravel, and then that will help us to think about how do we map for the future. So we've talked about the remarkable and rapid economic modernisation in Northeast and Southeast Asia. It was based upon an embrace of only some and not all of the principles of the so-called Washington Consensus pursued by the US and the Bretton Woods financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that urged developing countries to adopt market-oriented strategies. So in the West, there's expectation that the Washington Consensus will be followed. It isn't actually what happened on the ground. Asian growth leaders privileged pragmatism over theory. Now this I think is worth us stressing, that Asian leaders privileged pragmatism over theory as they pursued growth, allowing for the state to judge the appropriate pace of reform and the key role of government in providing stability, infrastructure, education, industry planning, and distributional aspects to manage change. At the same time, most East Asian economies embraced low tariffs and openness to foreign investment to attract capital and technology to develop globally competitive export industries, taking advantage of their surplus labour as their economies shifted from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services. This was the pragmatic approach that Asia took through the globalization period. It wasn't simply an embrace of Western ideas, Western neoliberal ideas as they were called at the time. It was a pragmatic smorgasbord sort of approach where Asian leaders picked those elements of the agenda, those elements of economic theory and other ideas being promoted by the IMF and others. They adopted some and they rejected others. And so that's very important, I think, as we look at Asia and as we look at China in particular. For decades, firms from the advanced economies, the so-called advanced economies of the West, moved east to benefit from developing global value chains, to source from whichever location offered competitive advantage, exporting to the advanced economies and consequently supercharging the growth of East Asian economies in what Bhagwati described as globalization's race to the top. The unprecedented economic expansion that happened during that globalization era created an Asian middle class of more than 1 billion people. It's arguably more than double that today, greater than the combined population of North America and Europe. Central to this East Asian development phenomenon was, of course, the post-1978 reform and opening up of China with its own adapted version of the East Asian development model. It was open to foreign investment, but it retained a share of the economy, a significant share of the economy, under direct state control, with industry planning for infrastructure and technological development. Now that's critical to understand because industry planning was very unpopular in the Western consensus in the globalization period, but industry planning was still central and fundamental to what China was doing. And you could argue the same about other East Asian economies as well, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, etc. Like Japan before it, China's integration of aid and finance with its trade and investment interests reflected its conviction that it had become indispensable to globalisation. So China becomes a financier, it becomes an aid giver, and it's just like Japan before it. It sees a way of integrating its aid and financial flows to support its trade and investment goals. And China also had confidence in its model, in the East Asian development model. China's late modernisation, compared with those other East Asian economies, allowed it to move at speed and to adopt the latest technologies brought into China by firms from the advanced economies to train its large and adaptable workforce and to apply process innovation to become indispensable to global value chains. China appeared to be committed to Asia's open regionalism and further liberalisation of trade through its web of bilateral trade agreements and membership of regional groupings APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and seeking membership actually of the CPTPP, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So this is important as well, because these regional trade groupings in Asia, starting with APEC, the all-important one that developed at the end of the 1980s, these are regional agreements about free trade and about free flows of investment and other standard setting and other principles around openness, about this open regionalism that Asian economies are committed to. And that, of course, includes my home economy of Australia, as well as Japan and others. So the idea of developing an open region, open to economic liberalisation and interdependence was fundamental in Asia. And China appeared through all these years and still appears in many respects, so we can debate that, to be committed to this Asian open regionalism. Mahbubani, a great Singapore commentator on these questions, is very confident that China's rise might yet strengthen rather than challenge the international system, partly because of that commitment to a rules-based trade order. With East Asia's resurgence, he believes, driven by its embrace of knowledge, internationalism and order, bringing greater respect for its meritocratic governance models and power, but in a more democratic, multipolar world. Now, that's pretty controversial in the West, but that's a view of a significant Singapore thinker. Parag Khanna, another commentator, argues that Asia, as the world's new strategic and economic theatre, will not be led or financed or dominated by one power, but is more likely to pursue a new multipolar, multi-civilizational balance. In Southeast Asia, with a long history of interaction with China, leaders tend to generate a more nuanced and multi-dimensional perspective on countries' interactions with the world, with Asian scholars, Asian thinkers, Asian leaders demonstrating a higher tolerance for multipolar complexity. And they have experience of deploying strategies of hedging and balancing, utilising a diversity of regional institutions to coexist with China. So these are the views we hear from leading Asian thinkers about multipolarity, about living with China and juggling China along with India, the US and others. So according to such reasoning, Asians may find Asian solutions for Asian problems. This reflects post-colonial thinking in the Asian region. It's starkly different from Western thinking that is universalist. Western universalist notions of international order that require Western thinking, Western values. And indeed, what you could argue is the still colonial thinking of some elements of the West, that Western values must prevail. This isn't the view in much of Asia. Indeed, Khanna argues Western normative expectations that China will militarise trade in the way that European powers did in previous times is misplaced. He claims that China is less likely to seek military hegemony than to secure its interests within a multipolar balance. there are other views here as well. Australia's preeminent geopolitical analyst, Hugh White, expects that China will seek regional hegemony, but that a new concert of powers will develop, likely to share power in Asia. And there are also voices in the US, such as Fareed Zakaria, claiming that the China challenge is much more complex than the simplistic alarmism that has taken hold in much of the West. So what then led us to the crisis of interdependence with China that we saw happening around the same time as the election of Trump, the beginning of the trade war, the COVID pandemic, and all of those things that started to happen at the end of the 2010s and into the early 2020s? Well, to be sure, China is changing the international system. It's changing the balance in the international order. And inevitably, this has generated geopolitical responses, even to what may, in many cases, to date at least, have been primarily geo-economic initiatives. Even if China does not act as aggressively as former rising powers did, in security terms, it is widely expected to wield greater regional and global power through commerce and through its economic infrastructure. The rise of China and its impact in the regional and world system became particularly prominent in the international economic discourse by the time of the financial crisis in the US and Europe around 2008. In that period, of course, China accounted for half of global growth, which moderated to a still powerful third of global growth, still today. In 2009, China overtook Germany to become the world's leading exporter, and by 2010 it had surpassed Japan to become the second largest economy in the world. So all of those changes occurred around the same time as this collapse in confidence in globalization in the West. Economists began to regularly publish forecasts that China was on a trajectory to overtake the US economy and to provide a competing source of global economic power. This had more than economic consequences, although economic power was at the heart of the change underway. So for the first time in decades, the US found itself facing a peer competitor, a major power with capabilities and intent to become a leading player in the global economy and with potential to build commensurate power in the international system. Further, a period of US domestic political dysfunction following 2 decades of widening inequality at home and failed military adventurism in the Middle East created a popular narrative that the world's sole superpower was in decline. I don't necessarily buy that argument. This discourse of a US decline has been around before, and so we should be cautious about accepting its inevitability. But Trump's catchphrase, "Make America Great Again," underlined how deeply Americans, and perhaps some others as well, saw America as slipping behind. The Western discourse returned for the first time since 1989 to an expectation that the world order would revert from a unipolar system dominated by the US to a new bipolar power struggle between the US and China. And Joe Biden, too, as president, reinforced this binary with his language about a generational battle between democracy and autocracy. This had the effect of sweeping away decades of confidence about complex interdependence. It swept away the confidence that we could trade, we could live with, we could work with countries that were different. There had been that confidence in the heady days of globalization. But by this time, with this crisis in interdependence, confidence collapsed. Interdependence was therefore in crisis by the early 2020s, amidst a trade war, geopolitical confrontation, pandemic, failure to arrest worsening climate change, and declining trust all around. World order was manifestly under stress, US confidence appeared to collapse, and a new populist politics took hold. Sceptical of interdependence, hostile towards international organisations and norms, and adopting strategic competition with China, asserting that China was gaining at the expense of US manufacturing and blaming China for the US merchandise trade deficit. Further, the crisis of interdependence with China crosses party lines in many of the liberal democracies. The liberal narrative of disappointment that China was not westernising as it was modernising, conflated with a conservative narrative that it was impossible to build strategic trust with an authoritarian China, appear to have led to the collapse of the earlier bipartisan consensus for pragmatic interdependence with China, while at the most geopolitical level, the most basic geopolitical level, the underlying power shift taking place appears to have stimulated a change of US strategy in an attempt to slow or reverse that shift. US opinion leaders have positioned the change as a battle of values and interests akin to a new Cold War. By 2020, a common refrain in American originated narratives warned that China was weaponizing everything from globalization even to the COVID-19 virus in its challenge to US power. Of course, viewed from China's perspective, it looked like a mirror image, with the US weaponizing everything from technology to geography. Indeed, a new geographic narrative was adopted at this time. Very important and often overlooked. In the same period, to mirror the continental geopolitical concept of Eurasia that had been around for a century, by replacing the common geographic term Asia-Pacific with a new maritime geopolitical concept, the Indo-Pacific. So Asia-Pacific had been a geographic description that we'd all used for decades. The United Nations still uses it, Asia-Pacific. It was a geographic description of a zone of economic opportunity. In that period of globalization, in that period of optimism, we talked about the Asia-Pacific economic cooperation. Indo-Pacific, just like the Eurasia term, which evokes competition to control Eurasia, Indo-Pacific is this new geopolitical term that's been introduced and has replaced Asia-Pacific in many Western countries. The Indo-Pacific has become the new geopolitical descriptor that imagines a semicircular collection of China's rivals stretching from India to the US, including Australia and Japan. It conjures a more binary outlook in which China is balanced by other powers, or perhaps constrained or contained, and it aligns with a new pessimism about interdependence. So here we are now. Instead of talking about the Asia-Pacific, instead of talking about optimism, about trade and investment and open regionalism, the new geopolitical language in many countries is now about the Indo-Pacific. And this immediately makes us think about battleships, submarines, geopolitical competition on the high seas, where, of course, the US has been dominant since the Second World War. So it becomes about a battle for retaining dominance. Indo-Pacific has all of this subconscious meaning behind it, whereas Asia-Pacific also had subconscious, I think, messaging in recent decades about economic openness and interdependence. So this change was more than just words. Economic warfare was broadly deployed to undermine economic interdependence. The US, which had amassed a huge debt-fueled trade deficit with China, launched a trade war, including massive tariffs against Chinese goods, export controls to choke key Chinese supply chains, such as semiconductors, and a campaign of economic coercion against leading Chinese firms such as Huawei and ZTE or ZTE, depending on your accent. Trump encouraged a decoupling narrative from China. The EU, the Europeans, began to de-risk from China, erecting trade and investment barriers to Chinese firms. During the first Trump presidency, it also appeared the US was withdrawing from elements of the liberal international order in the belief that global cooperation was not in US interests anymore, and further that globalization and global institutions had benefited rising China more than they had benefited the US. By the election of Joe Biden as president in 2020, a consensus had developed in the US that China's vision for world order was incompatible with that of the US. This consensus of conservatives and liberals was based not necessarily on an expectation that China would seek global domination or export its authoritarian domestic governance model, although many did believe that, but where there was common ground was in relation to the risks of interdependence. If, as widely believed, China's geoeconomic mission was to create a web of dependent partners able to be coerced to serve Beijing's interests. This became a popular refrain in much of the Western narratives. This fear appeared to be drawing the US away from its historic support for the multilateral trade system, which, to be sure, had often been inconsistent in its application, and towards a new mercantilism, mirroring the worst of the actions for which it criticised China. Biden doubled down on Trump's economic warfare against China, including expansion of US sanctions against China, triggering in response Chinese sanctions for firms and individuals who cooperated with the US sanctions. In this highly charged competition, economic and geopolitical and domestic human rights concerns were all frequently conflated. They were all mixed up together in the narratives. For the first time, the US government even began warning firms of risks in operating in Hong Kong, long considered amongst the freest economies, but now with human rights concerns conflated with business risk because of the city's new national security legislation targeting political opponents. This was certainly a new world of political risk. Nobody in the West had worried about the lack of democracy in Hong Kong when it was ruled by the British, for example. It was all about doing business, and it was all about reducing barriers to business. But now the new narrative is mixing up values with interests. Instead of just focusing on interests, as the interdependence theory does, now we have values. And once, of course, you introduce values, you can always believe that your side is better than the other side. Values leads to conflict. While total decoupling in an increasingly globally connected digital economy appears highly unrealistic, technology has become one of the key new battlegrounds. The crisis of interdependence has come at the same time as new technologies promise to digitalise manufacturing and many services, connecting devices, making decisions utilising AI, transforming supply chains and involving individuals, firms and nations everywhere in an ever more complex web of global interdependence. So technology is making us more interdependent, not less. Indeed, such interconnected technologies are likely platforms for new sustainable industries and supply chains to address the global challenge of climate change. New technology is particularly important to developing nations, which will have fewer opportunities than earlier, because in earlier times, developing nations could leverage manufacturing for growth. Now they're going to need to jump straight to higher value economic activities. China is actively positioning itself to be a leader of these transformational new technologies. The US has banned Chinese technology companies and is restricting exports of key technologies in China in an attempt to slow China's technological development, splintering technological interdependence in some critical areas such as semiconductors. The modern West that prospered in a bipolar world order and then in a unipolar US-dominated order has no experience of existing comfortably in a multipolar order in which the rise of China, India and other emerging economies, it will change the world. The apparently inexorable rise of China has begun to generate deep anxiety in the West, and certainly this was clear by around 2020. With public opinion of China plunging at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic spread across the globe. The US has subsequently doubled down to fight a normative narrative war against China, which, along with a parallel disillusionment in multilateralism, rule and norm-making, may generate further confrontation. And let's hope not, but potentially conflict. Now, we'll talk later about the Chinese side of all of this, but this is my analysis of how Western confidence in globalization plummeted and the rising fears of a China threat became so apparent by the early 2020s. As each point of interdependence with China is framed as a security threat, a new culture of fear is taking hold. A secular existential anxiety that catastrophizes what otherwise may be and I want to investigate this, they may be manageable risks. This new culture of fear mirrors the culture of fear that Hungarian philosopher Füredi talks about. He has characterised how in Western society in the early 20th century, in the interwar years, there was a time of moral panic featuring cultural pessimism, the undermining of expertise, and rising extremism that we saw in Europe, for example, in the 1930s. Not to mention, of course, at that time there was a shifting global power balance, and there was a pandemic, the flu pandemic as well. So all of those things that happened in the 1920s and 30s that are rather similar to things that are happening in today's world. That culture of fear that developed in Europe in particular in the 20s and 30s of a century ago, in other words, does appear to have returned in a new form. There is little space in the current pessimistic discourse for discussion about what future good global governance might look like in cooperation with China. There's not much space to talk about that, is there? It sounds naive. It sounds as if you're in some kind of fantasy world if you talk about positive global cooperation with China. But yet, 10 years ago, it was possible to have those conversations. There are certainly few voices outside China suggesting that China's institutional entrepreneurship, its creation of new international organisations, for example, or initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, provide any of the answer. On the contrary, these new Chinese initiatives are framed as threats to world order. Yet, just as in the globalisation era, it appears likely that Asia will innovate and Asia will contribute to global interdependence in different ways than Western policy prescriptions. This is the point I'm making, that we got the diagnosis wrong in the West about globalisation. We thought it was all about a westernisation of the world. It actually became about the development of non-Western areas of the world. And so this has become a threat to the West, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. We just have to find a way to manage these risks. So a non-normative understanding, a non-biased understanding of China's evolving approach to world order is therefore critical. And we're going to explore in the next episode the Chinese side of all of this.